When a government tells its people that it's opening up their coast to oil and gas leasing, like the Trump administration did from 2016 to 2020, there are quite a few things that happen behind the scenes that we don't realize happens until it's too late, and it's difficult to fix the changes, or they get ignored in this case. For example, the Trump administration opened up a swath of habitat along the shelf break on the Gulf of Mexico shore, the North Gulf of Mexico, for an oil and gas development. The same swath is a habitat of a critically endangered whale called the Gulf of Mexico whales, which used to be known as Rice's whale. You would think that the Biden administration would take that area away from the oil and gas industry, just like it did to the renewable wind industry. However, the National Marine Fisheries Service did not do anything to change the rule. And this example proves that the laws and regulations are very difficult to change for the better. We're going to talk about this on this episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin, and this is the podcast where you find out what's happening with the ocean, how you can speak up for the ocean, and what you can do to live for a better ocean by taking action. And today's episode, we're going to be talking about an article that I found on the NRDC, the National Resource Defense Council, I believe. And it's on their website. I'll put a link in the show notes. But we're going to talk about a new rule that would let oil industry harm the most endangered whale. Now that sounds like quite the headline. The copywriter was really good at that. And this is, we've seen this stuff happen before, not just with oil and gas, but governments, one government in power for whatever party they're at, changing legislation or rules that are hard to reverse or hard to, change. And because laws and regulations are hard to change, especially if the previous government makes it more difficult to change, but just government works slowly and it's very difficult to do. So I have a Canadian example, and of course we're going to talk about this example here. So in the article, it starts off just by saying that, last week, the National Marine Fisheries Service completed its review of regulations hurried out during the final day of the Trump's tenure on the impacts of seismic blasting on marine mammals in the Gulf of Mexico. So the Trump regulations were highly controversial, and they had been included, for example, on the Biden administration's initial short list of rules to review and potentially revise. And so with last week's announcement, you would have expected that the administration would propose changes more in line with the science and the law, and more protective of marine mammals, particularly the critically endangered Gulf of Mexico's whale, or Rice's whale. Instead, it proposed to do literally nothing. And that's the problem here. So I'm not sure if you all remember, but when Trump was in power, he was very pro oil and gas and getting back to the fossil fuel industry. He wanted to open up coal plants. He wanted to reopen the sale of leases to the oil and gas industry so that the U.S. can become more oil and gas independent and not depend on Russia's oil, not depend on Middle Eastern oil, and the prices of oil wouldn't be skyrocketing like it is now. That backfired. And it ended up being not true that the leases would help with this. However, that's something that's completely different from what we're covering on today's podcast. What we're covering on today's episode is more of what one administration can do. It doesn't matter if it's the US or Canada or the UK or Australia or South Africa or any other country. It doesn't matter. What matters is that it's difficult to change a rule once a rule is changed, to change a regulation or a law once it's changed. And that's what happened here. When the Trump administration was in power, they did a lot of changes to endangered species. They took the manatee, the Florida manatee, off of the endangered species list, which is in trouble right now. And they made changes to specific habitats that were allowed or not allowed to be changed or allowed to be explored for seismic surveys. So in this case here, we're talking about seismic surveys and the ability to do or not to do seismic survey, which is essentially oil and gas exploration in the Gulf of Mexico around probably one of the most critical habitats for the Gulf of Mexico whale that we've seen. And because this new species, it is a new species because it was identified as a new species separate from another species, and I'll put the link is in the article to go into that. There's less than 100 in the Gulf of Mexico, which makes it the most endangered cetacean, or one of the most endangered cetaceans around the world. And so, their protection needs to be done for this animal. But its most critical habitat is in a small swath on the northern slope, or this slope, this area in the northern Gulf of Mexico that the Trump administration has allowed or opened up for, seismic survey. Now, what is a seismic survey? Essentially, what a seismic survey is a series of guns, right? A set of guns, acoustic guns, that shoot out an acoustic blast down to the bottom of the ocean, from the surface down to the bottom of the ocean. And then that information is collected through the air pockets, or through the gun, like the blast, and it comes back up into receptors where the data comes in, and people can read the receptors and find oil deposits underneath the ocean's surface, or the ocean's floor. Great. That's a cool instrument. However, if we were in the water, it could destroy our eardrums. If marine mammals are in the water, it can temporarily affect their hearing. If they get it enough, just like if you were to listen to your earbuds at full power for an hour, when you take them out, your hearing threshold has changed, right? Temporarily, meaning you can't hear as well as you used to be able to hear. Okay? That may not be bothersome temporarily, but if you do this for 10 years or more, your hearing will permanently change. It won't be as sensitive, so it'll be harder to hear. So if the worry is that this is going to happen to marine mammals, right? Not only that, there's other things that can happen to marine mammals where the noise can frighten them. They start to go to the surface quickly. They get embolisms, like the bends, and they can be harmed from that. Other things similar to that that can affect their ability for survival. Plus, marine mammals, cetaceans especially, they communicate through noise, through sound. And so if you can't hear as well, that could be life or death experience for mother and calf, brother and sister, mother and adult son or daughter. Like it doesn't, it all affects their communication within a pod, which is very important for them. So it's a problem. And to open up, this type of exploration within the swath is very problematic for the species. So you'd expect with a new administration, the Biden administration, you expect after the review and potential revision, you would see revisions come out. But this seemed to have gotten ignored. I don't know why it got ignored, but it got ignored. And so it's still open. So if a oil and gas company wanted to do seismic surveys in this area, they'd have a hell of a time, or they wouldn't have that much a hard time doing it at this point in time. There would need to be changes to the Endangered Species Act. There'd need to be changes to this habitat area and so forth, but it'd have to be put down on paper. And so it could be very difficult to try and justify not having oil and gas in this area if that's done so. Now, will an oil and gas company do this, or a seismic company do this, knowing that this would be a problem? Maybe not, but it's there. It's open. It's just like in Canada, our marine protected areas, if it was over a lease site that was leased out to an oil and gas company can still explore in that area, even though it's a marine protected area. Well, not really a marine protected area, but it was an area that was protected in the marine space. But it wasn't truly a marine protected area, because a marine protected area is defined as no extractive or disturbance, human disturbance in that area. But I digress, right? But speaking of Canada, another example happened that I witnessed, that I was alive for, that I saw. A lot of times when we talk about this kind of stuff, we don't really notice it happen, but I was there for the full breadth of this, and it was painful. So when the Harper government was in power, 2010s, and before 2016, or 2015, I think, they were very pro natural resources, fossil fuels, and oil and gas. They wanted to build a pipeline from the tar sands in Alberta and Saskatchewan out to the west coast, the Pacific coast. They want to build a pipeline out there to get oil and gas out to that area so they can export to the Asian countries. Well, there was a lot of problems with that because we have a lot of regulations in Canada, Species at Risk Act. We have the Fisheries Act, which is an act that will protect fish and fish habitat. And so when they have to do this pipeline, they have to cross a lot of rivers, and we call them, or waterways, and we call those crossings. And they have to cross a lot of places. And so you have to do almost an environmental assessment for each crossing that you do. So just imagine you're going through a big part of the country, and Canada's a big country, and there's a lot of crossings. You have to do almost like an assessment for each one, or you have to acknowledge each one and do your research for each one. Well, that was taking too long for the companies, and the government said, you're right, that's taking too long. Let's change the law. So they changed the Fisheries Act to read out that it's not going to protect fish habitat anymore. It's going to protect fisheries that have been established for 30 years. That was very problematic for a lot of things that were going on, a lot of development and natural resource development that was happening in the ocean or along Canada, whether it be land or water or things. But this was water because it was fisheries. So I remember it changed everything. We had a new organization, or a new department or sector, I guess, or section within the sector. I don't know what they called it. But it was interesting. It was like a whole new section. They just got rid of one section, a fish habitat section, and they put in a fisheries protection section. And that was a big part of it. And everybody got moved over. People lost their jobs. People had to move jobs or move places or retire or things like that. Lots of people got displaced. The act changed, and over that 4 years, or 3 years or whatever it was that it changed, it was hard. New things were going to happen. Developments were going through because we weren't able to acknowledge fish habitat and so forth, and it was not good. When the Liberal government got in, change of power, and Trudeau came in, he said that part of his campaign promise that he would change the Fisheries Act not only to back to what it was, but even better to what it was, because no act is perfect. And so he did that, and he continued to do that. And I was following that. It was a big thing in my industry, Canadian. I was part of the federal government at the time, and I was following all the meetings that were happening and all the stuff that was coming out, the revisions and everything like that. And it was a long process, though. It took 4 years for them to come out with a new Fisheries Act. It was better than what it was before, but it still took 4 years, and people were complaining how long it took. But it's not easy when you're redoing a law. You have to do it by the letter of the government process. And so that means writing it up, revising it, changing it, revising it, writing up, sending it out for comment, coming back, changing it, writing it up, going to the House of Commons for a first reading, come back, go to the Senate, changes, come back for a second reading, go back to the Senate. It takes a long, long time. And during that time, damage can be done. And we'll never know really the damage unless somebody does the actual assessment, which I doubt that'll happen. We'll never know the true damage of what happened. And if it was up to Harper, he would have changed the Species at Risk Act too. He just didn't have enough time. He was ousted before, or not ousted, but he was voted out before. And Trudeau was voted in before that could happen. But that was next on his list. So my point here is that it doesn't matter what government you're a part of. It doesn't matter. If you make a change, it's very difficult to bring it back. And when we hear announcements like, hey, I'm going to open up the coastline to sell more leases, it doesn't mean people are going to do exploration. I'm going to sell more oil and gas leases. Well, there's a lot of changes that happen there, right? And those changes sometimes get ignored, or it takes too long to change them back to what they should be at that will protect the environment or protect the ocean better. And that's just the way it goes. And that's why it's important to know if environment is important on your list of things that your government needs to do, you need to vote for the most environmentally conscious candidates, right? If you want the best changes for your ocean around your country, voting matters, because the people who come in and change the law, it could be for the environment, it could be against the environment. We are the ones who pay, and the country is the one who pays. So if you don't want to do that, look at who you're voting for. Look at their environmental policies. Do they not have one? Okay, look at the candidates running against them. Do they have one? Maybe that's something you should consider. I'm not telling you how to vote, but if you want to vote for the environment, those would be the candidates you want to look for. I don't care if it's Democratic or Republican. I don't care if it's liberal or conservative. There's always someone who likes the environment, who will do things for the environment. And if you find someone who can do that, I highly recommend, it doesn't matter what party they're part of, I highly recommend that you vote them in or vote for them. But that's sort of the message today, is once something gets changed, it's hard to change back if it needs to be changed back for the ocean. So make sure we vote well, make sure we vote and do our research, and then vote sort of for the environment, for the ocean, for the planet. That's it for today's episode. I'd love to hear what you think of this. Have you found a regulation that's been changed that hasn't been changed back, or it takes a long time to change back? I would love to hear from you. Just hit me up on Instagram at How to Protect the Ocean. That's my new handle, at How to Protect the Ocean. I would love to hear from you. I answer back fairly quickly with Instagram, the DMs. So hit me up there. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of the Speak Up for the Ocean Blue podcast. I pre-recorded this before Speak Up for the Ocean Blue, How to Protect the Ocean. I'm still in that vibe. I did record this before the weekend, so I hope there's nothing that comes out before the weekend, because I'm at a tournament, a hockey tournament, before I record this, or after I record this, with my daughter. So I record this previously because I will have no voice after this, after the tournament. So that's why I record these previously. So wish me luck, and I'll let you know how it goes on the next episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.